It was 1945. The Reich had ceased to exist, but its corpse was still bleeding. The German cities, from Hamburg to Dresden, from Munich to Königsberg, had been transformed into open graves. There was no water, there was no electricity, there was no order. Mothers boiled whatever they found, potato peels, grass, pieces of brick to extract the white dust that deceived the stomach. The war had entered the homes. Defeat, on the other hand, had seeped into the bones. On the outskirts of Berlin, women dragged carts with their children asleep or dead inside, covered by a sheet or by indifference. Some wore party dresses covered in dirt, the only memory that had not been burned. The concept of home had dissolved. The walls no longer protected. The streets led to no future. The neighbors spied on each other out of fear or hunger. Everything had changed since that Germany of 1933. The rise of Hitler and the illusion of the German worker. The morning of the 30th of January of 1933 brought neither winds of war nor signs of tragedy. In Berlin, winter was as grey as ever, and the trams still screeched on the icy rails. But something different floated in the air. The radio announced with a dry but restrained voice that President Hindenburg had appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of the Reich. For some, it was just another fact in an unstable chain of governments. For others, a moment of restrained jubilation that would soon burst out into the streets. That night, torches illuminated the Brandenburg Gate. Thousands of supporters paraded along Unter den Linden, cheering, waving red flags with black swastikas inside white circles. Entire families came out onto balconies to watch the procession as if it were a religious ceremony. There was joy, hope, a sense that the impossible, the redemption of Germany, had begun. Inflation, unemployment, the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, the political instability of the Weimar Republic, all of that seemed at last to be starting to fade away. It was not just a political victory, it was a collective promise of salvation. In the working-class neighborhoods of Berlin, the reaction was ambiguous. Some looked with suspicion at that militarized parade, remembering the blows received from the brown shirts in previous years. But even there, in the midst of misery and distrust, phrases like, "Maybe now things will change," slipped through. Desperation leaves no room for principles when the stomach is empty and the future is a shadow. The middle class, especially small shopkeepers, employees and retirees, was the one that most quickly embraced the new order. They had been the great losers of the 1920s, victims of inflation that devoured their savings, of strikes, of riots, of parties that promised everything and solved nothing. When Hitler spoke of national unity, of being great again, of order and discipline, many felt that at last someone was giving them back their dignity. On Sundays, in cafes, they no longer spoke only about the price of bread, they spoke about the future. On a daily level, the change was rapid. In schools, portraits of President Hindenburg were replaced by those of Hitler. In the squares, children learned to salute with their arms raised. In shops, some merchants voluntarily removed non-German products. In churches, sermons began to refer to the spiritual rebirth of the German people. There were not yet laws, there were not yet camps, there were not yet uniforms for everyone, but there was a language that was beginning to take hold, the language of exclusion, of pride, of national destiny. Radios sold like hotcakes. The Volksempfänger set, the people's receiver, was launched that same year, affordable and simple, designed so that millions could listen to the words of the new leader. And they listened, in dining rooms, in workshops, in barbershops. Hitler's voice passed through walls like an omnipresent presence. His sharp tone, his prophetic cadence, his firm conviction convinced many who had never read Mein Kampf nor fully understood what he was saying, but he sounded authentic, he sounded strong, and in times of crisis, strength convinces. The youth organizations began to grow. Thousands of teenagers enrolled in the Hitlerjugend or in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, not all out of conviction, many because their friends were already there, because their parents recommended it, because it was the way to fit in. The brown uniforms, the badges, the songs, the outdoor walks, the games with knives, the marches in the woods, all of that created a sense of belonging that no school or parish had been able to offer before. At home, the change also manifested itself in small gestures. Family letters that spoke of hope, after-dinner conversations in which communists were criticized with more emphasis, jokes about Jews that had once been whispered and were now told with laughter. A shopkeeper who placed a sign in his window that read "Aryan business," not out of ideology, but because the neighbor had done it too and he did not want to be left behind, because neutrality was no longer possible. Either you applauded or you stayed silent. And silence in that new order was also suspicious. The 1st of May, Labor Day, was turned into a national holiday. Instead of workers' marches, there were shows, fireworks, balloons, patriotic speeches. Millions participated, unaware that the next day the regime would forcibly dismantle the free trade unions and found the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the German Labour Front, under Nazi control. Thus, while people celebrated in the streets, workers' freedom died in silence. No one protested, some out of fear, most out of indifference, others because they sincerely believed that this was how it should be. By the end of that first year, many Germans felt that things had indeed improved. Unemployment was beginning to decline thanks to public works programs. Highways, stadiums, public housing were being built. Promises became achievements, and that was more than any recent government had offered. The lines to get bread were shorter, the streets cleaner, the trains more punctual. The state seemed present, efficient, omnipresent, although it was already known that behind that efficiency there was repression. The first political purges were carried out in the shadows. The Communist Party was banned, its leaders were arrested or disappeared. Some went into exile. The Social Democrats soon suffered the same fate. The press was coordinated, the radio stations centralized, the books reviewed. Many civilians did not read the news about the concentration camps opened in Dachau or Oranienburg, not because they were hidden, but because they no longer mattered. They must have done something, people said, or simply said nothing. In family gatherings, politics was no longer discussed, or it was discussed with clichés, with quotes from the Führer, with complicit smiles. Because everyone knew that the neighbor was listening, that the cousin could denounce, that the butcher, the teacher, even one's own child could repeat what they heard at school. Denunciation became a silent form of loyalty, a tool for advancement, for revenge, or simply for fear. And fear began to seep into homes, into bedrooms, into silences. 1934 to 1935, the imposition of social control and the beginning of the Gleichschaltung. The initial fervor of the year 1933 did not dissipate immediately. The streets of Germany remained decorated with red flags, the radio persistently repeated the speeches of the Führer, and popular enthusiasm was still evident in the extended greetings, in youth marches, in the full stadiums during patriotic celebrations. But as 1934 progressed, the enthusiasm began to transform into something more subtle and oppressive. A choreography of constant obedience, a way of living that required caution, silence, and above all, conformity. The Gleichschaltung, the total coordination of the individual with the ideals of the Nazi state, was not yet a common word in households, but it was already an everyday reality. German civil life began to be organized under an unofficial but omnipresent surveillance system. In neighborhoods, local associations became networks of ideological control. Traditional street corner chats came under observation. On every block, a block lighter, block leader, acted as an intermediary between the party and the community. He could be a shopkeeper, a doorman, a retiree. His past did not matter. Now his function was to record, listen, report. He often knew all the neighbors by name, and everyone knew who he was. He did not need to say anything. His mere presence was enough to keep conversations within permitted boundaries. In households, parents learned to measure their words. Children returned from school, repeating phrases from the Führer, singing patriotic songs, asking whether greetings at home were like those in class. School was now an extension of the party. Teachers, some convinced, others resigned, had been integrated into the NS-Lehrerbund, the National Socialist Teachers' League. The content of textbooks had been modified. History began in 1914 and ended in 1933, as if the Weimar period had been a fleeting shadow. Biology became a tool to explain racial differences. Arithmetic was illustrated with problems about the cost of maintaining a hereditary ill person. German was used to read and memorize fragments of Mein Kampf. Parents who disagreed learned to stay silent. Some burned books on their own initiative. Others hid photographs of Jewish relatives. Some simply stopped talking about politics. It was easier to teach children to repeat what they heard outside, even if they did not believe it inside. In small towns, that duplicity was even more evident. Everyone knew each other. Everyone knew who had been a communist, who had liberal ideas, who had done business with Jews. But now everyone pretended to have always been loyal. Forgetting became a defense mechanism. Work also did not escape the new order. Since the dissolution of the trade unions, every worker came under the tutelage of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the German Labour Front. There were no longer wage negotiations or collective demands. Strikes disappeared overnight. The atmosphere in factories changed. People worked more, talked less. Employees competed to appear more loyal, who greeted first, who hung the party flag in the office, who contributed more to the Winterhilfswerk collections. Professional merit began to matter less than party affiliation. Promotions and dismissals were often decided based on what one represented for the new order. Women were called to fulfill a defined and narrow role, mothers and guardians of the home. The Deutsches Frauenwerk and the NS Frauenschaft organized meetings, national cooking classes, talks on racial hygiene, gatherings to sow and educate new generations. At first glance, it seemed like a domestic support network, but every meeting included slogans, songs, ideological training. The ideal German woman was strong, fertile, obedient. The state needed her not only to produce children, but future soldiers. Those who worked outside the home began to be viewed with suspicion. In offices, post offices, hospitals, they were reminded that their true place was in the kitchen, not at a desk. Free time was also reorganized. The organization Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, offered excursions, courses, concerts, and recreational activities for workers. At first glance, it was an improvement in quality of life, but every outing was accompanied by symbols, speeches, flags. Every song taught carried a political message. Germans began to live in a system where even rest was directed. The idea of choosing how to spend time began to fade. The press was one of the first complete victims of the Gleichschaltung. In 1934, most independent newspapers had disappeared or had been absorbed by publishers aligned with the party. Reading the newspaper became a repetitive, predictable act. All the news was good. Germany was reborn. The economy improved. The Führer was loved. Bad news was what was not published. In some homes, old newspapers from before 1933 were kept as relics, or small clandestine radios picked up foreign signals. But using them was an unnecessary risk. Listening to a foreign station could mean prison. Commenting on what was heard, something worse. In 1934, the regime consolidated its power through crime. On the 30th of June, during the so-called Night of the Long Knives, The SA, the original stormtroopers of the Nazi movement, were purged. Ernst Röhm and other leaders were killed by direct orders from Hitler. The event was explained to the people as a preventive measure, a defense of order, and many believed it or pretended to believe it because crime no longer caused scandal. It was justified. It was necessary. The idea of justice began to be confused with obedience. Laws were no longer meant to protect, but to discipline. The death of Hindenburg in August of 1934 sealed the fate of the Republic. Hitler assumed the title of Führer und Reichskanzler, unifying the head of state and head of government. A national plebiscite was organized to legitimize this maneuver. The majority voted yes in a climate of pressure, surveillance, and propaganda. Voting was mandatory. Ballots were cast in monitored urns. In many towns, neighbors knew who had not voted. Democracy, already moribund, was buried with popular honors. Most civilians did not mourn its disappearance. Stability seemed to matter more than freedom. Jews began to be progressively excluded from everyday life. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws institutionalized discrimination, but even before that, it was already noticeable in daily life. In cafes, some signs read, "Jews not allowed." In banks, procedures became difficult if the surname was Semitic. In markets, some women avoided shopping at non-Aryan stores. Physical violence was not necessary. Social rejection was enough, the look that turned away, the greeting that was no longer offered. Jews, until then part of the German community, began to disappear from the landscape without the need for shouting. Silence alone was enough. In just 2 years, German public space was completely redefined. Walking down a street was an experience saturated with symbols, swastikas on every building, uniforms everywhere, portraits of the Führer in schools, stations, pharmacies. Conversations were controlled, emotions measured. In the privacy of the home, some still remembered the recent past, but the present was increasingly strong, louder. Resisting was dangerous, adapting easier, and most chose to adapt. Legal and social exclusion of the Jews and non-Aryans, the German streets remained clean, orderly, decorated with red flags that hung like perpetual curtains of an unchanging stage. The radios still broadcast patriotic marches, the children still sang songs of the Hitlerjugend, and the party officials walked on the sidewalks as if they were guardians of a superior morality. But something in the landscape was beginning to fade, not with stridency, not yet with public violence, but with a progressive absence. The Jewish families, who for generations had shared cafes, libraries, banks, schools, and clubs with their neighbors, were beginning to become invisible, not because they were hiding, but because the rest stopped seeing them. Starting in 1935, the process of exclusion became law. On the 15th of September, during the party congress in Nuremberg, the regime announced the enactment of the laws for the protection of German blood and honor and the Reich citizenship law. From that moment on, the lives of thousands of people changed in a brutal way. The Jews ceased to be German citizens. They lost their nationality. They lost basic civil rights such as voting, holding public office, or marrying non-Jews. But beyond the legal content, what changed for them, and for everyone, was the atmosphere. Exclusion became official, accepted, administered. In everyday life, the consequences were soon felt. In the cafes, former Jewish customers stopped appearing. Some were discreetly expelled. Others understood that they were not welcome. Shop owners who continued selling to Jews received warnings, anonymous notes, visits from members of the SA. The Aryan barbershops put up signs clarifying that they did not serve non-Germans. The pharmacies that still filled prescriptions from Jewish doctors were monitored. At first glance, no one forbade anything with shouts, but everyone understood that the line had already been drawn. In schools, Jewish children began to be separated. First, they were ignored, then insulted, finally segregated. The principals, who had to report how many non-Aryan students there were, justified the transfers as a need for pedagogical harmonization. In biology classes, students learn to measure skulls, to differentiate racial profiles, to identify degenerate types. The children repeated without understanding, but they learned to look with suspicion at the classmate whose last name did not sound sufficiently German. At recess, the games no longer included everyone. Shoving and laughter mixed with mockery, spitting and contempt. Cultural life also changed. Cinemas began to remove films directed or performed by Jews. Theaters dismissed actors and musicians with inconvenient last names. Publishers cancelled contracts. Universities annulled chairs. But none of this happened in secret. Lists were published. Replacements were announced. The cleansing of the German spirit was celebrated. The public, with few exceptions, accepted the changes as natural. Some protested quietly, others lamented them in private, but no one dared to write a letter, to sign a complaint, to raise a hand at a meeting. In neighborhoods, social relationships began to break. Neighbors who had once shared conversations, dinners, or birthdays with Jewish families began to avoid them, not all out of conviction, many out of fear. A visit, a poorly spoken word, a smile at the wrong time could be observed. The blocklighter took note, and the risk was real. A single denunciation, anonymous, false or malicious, was enough for a citizen to be investigated, interrogated, punished. Thus, friendship became suspicious. Greeting became dangerous and silence a shield. The emotional consequences were devastating. Jewish families lived under constant tension. They had to explain to their children why they could no longer go to the same school, why their mother could no longer shop in a certain store, why they were no longer invited to birthdays. Many tried to maintain routine, reading, studying, visiting grandparents, writing letters. But the days were filled with refusals, with closed doors, with glances that turned away. Some tried to adapt, others began to make plans to emigrate. But obtaining a visa, a ticket, a destination was increasingly difficult. The world was not opening, it was closing. Outside, most German civilians were beginning to normalize that exclusion. They did not think about it, they did not question it, they simply continued with their lives. Some even celebrated it. The regime's propaganda took care of justifying everything. The Jews were responsible for the defeats, for the misery of the post-war period, for cultural degeneration, for the international conspiracy. Children's magazines showed grotesque caricatures. The newsreels in cinemas broadcast speeches that spoke of racial hygiene. The words were repeated so much that they lost their weight. No one argued against them because they had learned not to argue. The exclusion also reached other groups. The Roma, the homosexuals, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the disabled began to feel the weight of the state on their backs. But the civilian population hardly found out, or they found out and did not ask. What was not seen did not hurt. And what was seen was accepted with resignation. The Gleichschaltung had not only coordinated institutions, it had aligned consciences. The average citizen knew what to say, what to keep quiet about, what to look at and what to avoid. They learned to live within the margins and not to help those who were left out. On the radio, Hitler's speeches became more intense. There were words about purity, about destiny, about the duty of the German people. In the stadiums, salutes multiplied. The crowds repeated with precision each gesture, each slogan. But beneath that synchrony there was a profound renunciation, the renunciation of the other. The German people, for the most part, accepted that there were citizens who had to be excluded, who did not deserve the same rights, who were not part of the whole. And that acceptance, although passive, allowed everything that would come after. In public offices, employees began to receive new forms. In them, the racial origin of parents and grandparents had to be declared. It was not enough to be German. It had to be proven, and that proof became a requirement for everything: to marry, to work, to study. Those who could not demonstrate full Aryanness were removed, sometimes without explanations, other times with letters that spoke of the interests of the Reich. The people who had once been full citizens became Staatsangehörige ohne Staatsrechte, inhabitants without rights. Their history, their service, their love for the country did not matter. A single line in their ancestry was enough to turn them into pariahs. In mixed families, the tension was unbearable. A Jewish wife, a non-Aryan father, a converted uncle were enough to break entire structures. Some chose divorce, others were forced to resign. There were those who committed suicide or disappeared. Family gatherings became moments of fear. Who would attend? What could be said? Who would be the first to denounce the other? Because now, belonging was not cultural, it was biological, and no one could change it. And yet, in the midst of that invisible advance of darkness, everyday life continued. Trains arrived on time, bakeries opened, parks were full of children, women queued at the market, men read the newspaper. Germany did not seem like a dictatorship, it seemed like a country in order, clean, at peace. But beneath that surface, a precise mechanism of exclusion, of isolation, of slow destruction unfolded. The German people, for the most part, did not ask for blood. They did not ask for camps, they did not ask for pogroms, but they did accept, day after day, the symbolic disappearance of the Jewish neighbor. They accepted their silence, their inner exile, their progressive expulsion, not out of open cruelty, but out of structural indifference, out of fear, out of habit. Because the machinery of the Third Reich was not sustained only by violence. It was sustained by the comfort of those who chose not to look. In 1935 and 1936, Germany was not yet a concentration camp. It was an orderly, enthusiastic, convinced society. But in that enthusiasm, the tragedy was already hidden. Because every smile at seeing the young uniformed march, every gesture of approval at seeing a Jewish store close, every whisper that celebrated racial purity, was another stone on the road to the abyss. Mass culture, propaganda, and discipline from childhood. Civil life in Germany in the mid-30s unfolded in an increasingly rigid, predictable order, saturated with symbols. Everything was wrapped in a choreography of obligatory enthusiasm. On the surface, the country was advancing. New highways cut through rural landscapes like clean scars, trains arrived on time, cities were decorated with flowers and swastikas. German and foreign tourists spoke of cleanliness, progress, and healthy youth. But behind every postcard, a system of ideological control that never rested was being reinforced. And that control began in the most sensitive place, the children. From the earliest years of life, German childhood was shaped by a deeply political education. State-run nurseries introduced games and songs that exalted love for the homeland, obedience to the Führer, and rejection of the internal enemy. Teachers, trained in academies where racial pedagogy was taught, spoke of purity of blood with the same naturalness with which they taught counting. Every drawing hanging on the walls bore swastikas and patriotic phrases written in childlike cursive. Every gesture, every slogan, every act of play served one single goal: to create obedient, strong, and useful Germans for the Reich. At 10 years of age, boys entered the Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, and girls the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls. From then on, free time ceased to be truly free. Afternoons were filled with marching, singing, physical instruction, outdoor activities, community work, and ideological indoctrination. Weekends were for camping or visiting the memorial of some past battle. Holidays were organized in party camps. Even children's birthday parties were used to reinforce discipline. The children saluted the Führer, were taught to look proudly at the portrait hanging in the living room and to distrust anything different. School education was also completely subordinated to the state. History began with Germanic greatness and ended with the arrival of Hitler. The medieval past was exalted. The defeat of 1918 was explained as a stab in the back orchestrated by Jews, communists, and internal traitors. Geography taught the lost German territories as a future promise of expansion. Natural sciences were used to explain the superiority of the Nordic race. Gymnastics took up more hours than literature. The body had to be strong, useful, resistant. Critical thinking was viewed with suspicion. The ideal was a student who marched, repeated, and obeyed. At home, many parents supported this process with sincere enthusiasm, but others did so out of fear. Refusing to send a child to the youth groups was seen as a subversive act. There were cases where children themselves denounced their parents for attitudes contrary to the national spirit. Such stories were spread with morbid pride. The party celebrated that kind of loyalty. Thus, a new morality was built where obedience to the state stood above family ties. In the heart of the home, distrust was born. Popular culture was another tool of domestication. The media was strictly controlled. Radios, affordable and ubiquitous, only broadcast approved music, official speeches, and programs that reinforced the regime's values. News was selected, crafted, and repeated to exhaustion. Every government success was celebrated as a miracle, every technological advance as a victory of Aryan blood. Newspapers did not inform, they indoctrinated. Television barely existed, but cinema became the great mass instrument. Comedies, historical dramas, rural melodramas were released. All of them, to a greater or lesser degree, contained nationalist, racist, or militarist messages. Filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl premiered in 1935 The Triumph of the Will, a documentary about the party congress in Nuremberg that transformed propaganda into art. The images showed hypnotized crowds, perfect columns of youth marching, Hitler descending from the sky like a divine figure. The film was screened in schools, factories, women's associations. The images spoke for themselves. There was no explicit violence, but rather a powerful, aesthetic, enveloping seduction. Order, discipline, and absolute faith were celebrated. And that message sank deep into a population that, after years of chaos, longed precisely for that. Order. Sports were also integrated into the system. In 1936, Germany hosted the Olympic Games. Berlin was filled with flags, monuments, athletes, tourists. Everything was organized with a perfection that dazzled the world. The regime temporarily hid the most brutal aspects of its policy to project a friendly image. Anti-Semitic signs were taken down. Attacks ceased. Even some Jewish German athletes were included as a calculated gesture. For 15 days, Germany seemed like a modern, tolerant, vibrant nation. But it was just a mask. When the cameras were turned off, the machinery returned to its usual rhythm. Civil life, meanwhile, was becoming soaked in a new routine where everything was filtered through the party. Weddings were celebrated with rituals exalting Aryan Germanic fertility. Birthdays included official songs. Children's publications told stories where the heroes were blonde and the villains had hooked noses. In every shop, office, or hair salon, there were portraits of Hitler. At train stations, signs reminded people of the need to watch for the internal enemy. The Nazi salute was used to begin classes, neighborhood meetings, theater sessions. There were no neutral spaces. Propaganda even reached the most trivial objects. Matchboxes bore patriotic slogans. School notebooks had the Führer's face on the cover. Postal calendars marked the important dates of National Socialism. Christmas cards came decorated with pagan symbols repurposed by the regime. In the supermarket, Aryan products were proudly promoted. Buying chocolate or soap became a political act. Domestic life was an extension of the state. Artists who did not align were sidelined, silenced, exiled. Bookstores stopped selling banned authors. Jewish or modernist musicians were replaced by pure performers. Jazz was declared degenerate. Painting had to be realistic, heroic, masculine. Architecture became monumental, cold, authoritarian. Culture was no longer a pursuit, but an affirmation of power, and the public, accustomed to directed consumption, began to forget that it could choose. The ordinary citizen, meanwhile, adapted, some out of conviction, others out of habit. Those who did not sympathize with the regime learned to pretend. Appearances mattered more than ideas. One could survive if they knew when to salute, what to read, whom to avoid. Mass culture offered an illusion of unity, a collective belonging that was comforting. There were parades, shows, celebrations, and also fear, but fear became bearable when wrapped in music and flags. Thus, between patriotic songs and organized outings, between radio speeches and carefully edited films, the German people lived their deformed normality. Propaganda was not just an institutional apparatus, it was an atmosphere. It was in the air, in the school, in the plaza, in children's beds. The civilian mind was shaped day by day from childhood, and after just a few years, millions of people could no longer distinguish between truth and falsehood, between conviction and repetition. They only knew they had to march straight, smile on time, and say, "Heil Hitler," even if deep down they no longer knew why. Tourism, sport and leisure in Nazi Germany, leisure as an extension of the regime. By the end of 1937, the daily life of the German citizen unfolded in an apparent stability. The economy had reactivated, public works advanced efficiently, and the speeches spoke of greatness, future and unity. But that balance was false. Fear was no longer a marginal sensation, but an intimate habit. And yet the population did not live only under repression, they also lived in illusion. The regime had understood that it was not enough to control, it had to seduce. Not only to dominate bodies, but to conquer wills. For that reason, in the years prior to the war, Hitler and his ministers turned leisure, rest, sport, and tourism into spaces of propaganda, discipline, and social cohesion. The organization Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, became a central actor in the lives of millions of Germans. This enormous state structure, dependent on the German labor front, offered tourist packages, excursions, art classes, lectures, concerts, cinema tickets, theater plays, and Mediterranean cruises, all at low cost. Vacations were planned by the state. They were not simple trips. They were experiences carefully designed to reinforce national identity, eliminate class differences, and cultivate the collective spirit. The working-class family that had never left its neighborhood could suddenly see the Baltic Sea, climb a mountain, or sail to Norway aboard the luxurious ship Wilhelm Gustloff. The itineraries, however, were marked by an ideological narrative. Germanic historical sites were visited, lectures were offered on the values of the Reich, and collective dinners were held where National Socialist hymns were sung. In each excursion there were party representatives, responsible for ensuring proper behavior and for recording any suspicious attitude. Every rest was monitored, and surveillance, as in all of Nazi Germany, was accepted as part of order. Domestic tourism also grew spectacularly. Visits to the Bavarian Alps, the Thuringian Forest, the Black Forest, and the medieval castles were promoted. Geography was imbued with national symbolism. Traveling became a patriotic act. Tourist guides changed their style. They were no longer neutral, but openly political. They described landscapes saved from the Jewish spirit, purified regions, or spaces of Germanic blood. Maps marked the places with mythical value for National Socialism: Linz, Nuremberg, Berchtesgaden. Each step reinforced the idea of belonging. In the cities, leisure time was also shaped. Squares were filled with popular festivals organized by the party. Labor Days, Peasant Days, Mother's Days were celebrated, always with parades, hymns, speeches, and rituals. Each date had a symbolic value: to remember the importance of manual labor, to exalt the fertility of the Aryan woman, to thank the guidance of the Führer. In these events, the line between festivity and discipline was invisible. Civilians participated en masse, not always out of conviction, but because being absent could raise suspicion. Sports clubs, which had flourished during the Weimar Republic, were absorbed by the state apparatus. Healthy competition was replaced by ideologically oriented physical training. Children and teenagers received military training disguised as physical activity. Endurance, toughness, and sacrifice were exalted. Women were directed towards gymnastic exercises linked to maternal health. The body was not a space of freedom, it was a tool of the state. Mass sports events were also politicized. Outdoor gymnastic gatherings, athletic parades, and strength tests were used to show the world the vitality of the new German people. The culmination of this strategy was undoubtedly the organization of the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936, which still in 1938 and 1939 generated echoes in civil life. Monumental architecture, perfect staging, grandiloquent gestures, fireworks, flag parades. Everything was designed to project to the world the image of a modern, orderly, and powerful Germany. But that image hid exclusion. While German tourists enjoyed their organized vacations and citizens watched football matches with subsidized tickets, Jews were already completely excluded from access to theaters, public swimming pools, recreational associations, and any kind of shared space. Their disappearance was not only legal, it was physical, spatial, every day. No one asked where they were. No one demanded their presence. German leisure was a racial privilege. The structure of daily life was also regimented. Punctuality was an absolute value. The Nazi salute had to be used at work, at school, even in encounters between neighbors. Traditional courtesy was replaced by obligatory devotion. Going to the cinema, to the theater, or to a lecture was no longer a private option. It was a way of showing adherence to the regime. Every leisure activity was loaded with political content. Even family celebrations adapted to the state's slogans. At children's birthdays, national hymns were sung. At weddings, Germanic rituals devised by the SS were included, and at Christmas stars were replaced by runic symbols or black suns. Some sectors of the population began to experience a silent void. Intellectuals, artists, citizens not affiliated with the party, people with a critical spirit or simply tired of the official noise felt that there was no neutral space left. One could not read without checking the author. One could not speak without measuring the words. One could not listen to music without knowing its racial origin. One could not walk without crossing flags, portraits, phrases of the Führer. Life became a permanent parade, and in that parade one could march or disappear. At the same time, many Germans, especially young people, found a powerful sense of belonging in this framework. The Kraft Deutsche Freude offered them experiences they had never been able to have before. The sports parades gave them visibility. The party organizations offered them advancement, respect, camaraderie. In the cities, thousands of men and women began to believe that Nazism was their only possible homeland. The outbreak of war and the militarization of civil life. The morning of the 1st of September of 1939 began like so many others in Germany. Radios were turned on early, newspapers were delivered by boys on bicycles, the usual movement of trams and offices opening in the big cities. But shortly before noon, a broadcast interrupted the programming. Adolf Hitler announced that, after Polish provocations, German troops had crossed the border. Germany was at war. The news was received with a complex mix of emotions: enthusiasm, fear, fatalism, and obedience. Some applauded in silence, others cried, but almost no one protested. For most civilians, the beginning of the conflict was not experienced as an immediate catastrophe. The images of motionless trenches and devastated fields like in 1914 seemed distant. Propaganda insisted that this would be a short, just, preventive war. A war for the security of the German people. The streets did not fill with mourning, but with posters. Instructions were distributed, party meetings were organized, bloc leaders were summoned. The discipline the regime had instilled over 6 years now began to operate with military precision. The first impact was psychological. Conversations changed. People no longer talked about the price of bread, the weather, or holidays with the craft durch Freude. Now they spoke of drafted men, military destinations, maps. People studied Europe with a new logic, not as a cultural space, but as a battleground. Radios broadcast official reports in a triumphant tone. The first weeks were a succession of news of advances, images of the German army crossing Poland, the captured prisoners, the occupied cities generated a feeling of unstoppable power. The initial fear gradually faded, replaced by a militarized euphoria. The most immediate change was the partial mobilization of the economy. Young men began to be called up. Many volunteered, train stations filled with families bidding farewell to their sons, brothers and husbands with applause, Nazi salutes and promises of victory. But behind every waving handkerchief there was fear. Women knew life would change. Support committees were quickly organized. Groups to make winter clothing for soldiers, food collection chains. The role of women in the home intensified. Now they not only had to raise children and serve the Reich, they had to sustain the home front. Civil life became militarized from within. Schools began to function as centers of moral instruction. Children drew tanks, learned martial hymns, studied geography with maps of occupied Poland. Games were organized in which battles were reenacted. Death began to enter school vocabulary. The Hitler youth received stricter training. Girls in the Bund Deutscher Mädel were indoctrinated in the value of sacrifice, patriotic motherhood, and endurance under hardship. In every neighborhood, inspections, censuses, and requests for collaboration with the war effort were intensified. The state imposed food rationing at record speed. Ration books began to be distributed that same autumn. Each citizen had to present a document at the market with coupons marking their entitlement to meat, bread, fat, eggs, sugar. Access to coffee and chocolate was restricted. Substitutes, ersatz, multiplied. Barley coffee, vegetable butter, beetroot soup. At first there was order. Germans were trained to accept rules. No one protested about standing in line, but conversations in the markets began to fill with whispers, with half-spoken phrases. How long will this last? My son is not eating well anymore. Transportation was also affected. Roads and trains were prioritized for military use. Personal travel began to be restricted. A nighttime blackout was imposed in all cities. Windows had to be covered with black curtains. Street lights were turned off. Vehicles used dimmed lights. There were heavy fines for violating these rules. In many homes, windows were taped to prevent shards in case of an explosion. Bombs had not yet fallen, but the country already lived as if under attack. Propaganda redoubled its intensity. Every poster, every pamphlet, every radio announcement spoke of resistance, unity, duty. The images showed smiling soldiers, proud families, children sending letters to the front. Events were organized to boost morale, patriotic plays, concerts with songs from the front, exhibitions of tanks and weaponry. Even entertainment had to serve the cause. Films depicted German heroism, the brutality of the enemy, the necessity of obedience. Everyday language filled with words like Volksgemeinschaft, Einsatz, Treue, Pflicht. Private emotion was replaced by collective slogans. The Jews by then were completely outside the national community. If in 1935 exclusion was legal, by 1939 it had become practical and brutal. The 9th of November of 1938 had marked a turning point, the Kristallnacht. Burned synagogues, destroyed shops, thousands of arrests and deportations marked a definitive shift. From that moment on, being Jewish in Germany meant living in constant danger. They could not own radios, use public transport, receive milk, or go out after certain hours. Families lived confined, silenced. Sometimes neighbors helped in secret, but most simply looked the other way. With the beginning of the war, that situation became more extreme. Jews were forced to hand over their radios, bicycles, pets. They were assigned zones of residence, expelled from central apartments, forbidden from shopping in many businesses. Every week, a new restriction. The Aryan population grew accustomed to not seeing them, or to seeing them as shadows. Terror became normalized. The violence prior to the conflict, which in 1938 had been public, now gave way to a more systematic and silent cleansing. At the same time, civilians' emotional life began to change. Farewells, telegrams from the front, letters written in military language, the first reports of the wounded disrupted daily life. Mourning became a constant possibility. Women gathered to console each other, to share news, to sew or pray. Some older men were called up for administrative duties. Teenagers dreamed of going to the front. The youngest played at being soldiers. War entered homes not with bombs, but through habit. Simultaneously, the regime deployed stricter mechanisms of social control. Meetings were monitored. Complaints were noted. Defeatist songs were banned. Neighbors were encouraged to report unenthusiastic attitudes. Letters from the front were read by censors. Telephone calls could be intercepted. The German citizen knew they had to watch every word, even every gesture. Because the war was not only fought in Poland, it was also fought in the living room, in the market, in the classroom. And yet, in the autumn of 1939, many civilians still believed that the war would be brief. The rapid fall of Warsaw, the signing of the pact with Stalin, the lack of immediate military reaction from France and Great Britain created an illusion of victory. The lightning war seemed real. The sirens had not yet sounded in Berlin. The fields were still green. Children still played on the sidewalks. The ruins did not yet exist. The home front as a stage of participation and sacrifice. The war became real when winter arrived without enough coal, when bread began to be darker and scarcer, and when letters from the front stopped arriving. If the outbreak of the conflict had been received in 1939 with a mixture of nationalist excitement and confidence in victory, by 1940 and 1941 the German civilian population was beginning to experience firsthand the daily weight of a war that did not end. It was not yet destruction, open bombing, or collapse. It was the slow transformation of life into a routine of deprivation, surveillance, and constant duty. The cities were not trenches, but they were bastions of a deeply mobilized rearguard. In homes, the conflict settled into the smallest habits. Each family kept on the kitchen table a calendar with rationing schedules, shifts for coal distribution, and dates for the donation campaigns of the Winterhilfswerk, the party's winter aid program. Housewives, far from withdrawing from public life, assumed a key role in managing scarcity. They learned to stretch butter, to replace milk with powder, to use potato flour as a substitute. Domestic ingenuity became a form of patriotism. In neighborhood gatherings, more than recipes, strategies were shared: how to boil bones a third time, how to dye a shirt with beetroot to disguise its wear, how to convince the butcher to hand over an extra piece of fat. The regime's propaganda exalted this female effort. Posters, pamphlets, and short films showed smiling mothers surrounded by blonde children in clean kitchens, cooking with patriotic pride. A woman was no less a soldier for not wielding a weapon. Her battlefield was the stove, the laundry, the classroom where she taught the children that father was at the front and that victory was near. The awarding of prizes for the number of children continued, but with a graver tone. It was not just an act of recognition, but a biological duty. In neighborhoods, winter Hilfswerk campaigns became omnipresent. Throughout the winter, party volunteers went through houses, shops, train stations, asking for donations for soldiers, for widows, for the compatriots in need of the East. No one could refuse. Contributions were recorded, omissions remembered, small badges or certificates were given to attest to the contribution. Wearing the badge on the lapel became as important as raising the Reich flag on patriotic dates. It was a gesture of social inclusion, of belonging. Refusing, even out of poverty, was suspicious. Social control, although not yet as brutal as it would be in later years, intensified. Conversations in low voices, gestures of fatigue, comments about the front were observed. In every block, in every factory, someone took notes. Radios were intervened. Only national stations could be tuned in. Listening to foreign stations was punishable by prison or, in serious cases, by deportation. Information was a straight line, victory after victory, advance after advance. France defeated in weeks, the Netherlands occupied without significant resistance, Norway controlled. The German citizen listened to the reports of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and believed, or pretended to believe, that the war was almost won. Letters from the front began to take on a different tone. They were no longer just epic tales of advance and glory, but brief, measured, and sometimes encrypted descriptions of the harshness of combat. German soldiers who fought in Norway in North Africa or on the Eastern Front could not tell everything, but they hinted at the cold, the lack of supplies, the exhaustion. Mothers read between the lines. Some burned the letters, others hid them. It was dangerous to show them. The words from the front did not always match those of the Ministry of Propaganda. The Volksgemeinschaft, that people's community promised as an ideal of racial and social unity, became another weapon of the regime. Community nights were organized for knitting, for reading war reports, for listening to speeches by the Führer. Uniformity was encouraged, not only ideological but also emotional. Anguish had to be silent, uncertainty concealed. Those who cried in public were looked at with reproach. Sadness became suspicious, patriotism obligatory. Young people, meanwhile, were mobilized with greater force. The Hitler Jugend acquired a military character. Teenagers received physical training, instruction with weapons, lessons in cartography, obligatory marches. They were taught to survive with little, to endure the cold, to not sleep more than necessary. By the age of 15, many already knew what it was to shoot. They were openly prepared for the day they would have to go to the front. The girls of the BDM were sent to the countryside to replace men in the harvests, to work in offices, hospitals, nurseries. Female labor ceased to be a rarity. It became a necessity. Public celebrations maintained their rhythm, but their tone became more solemn. They were no longer just parades of flags and empty speeches. There were altars with photographs of the fallen, lists of local soldiers, mothers with black armbands. In each city, bookstore windows displayed alongside Goethe's classics the portraits of frontline heroes. Stories of fallen soldiers who died smiling with a letter from the Führer on their chest were spread. Death was glorified, not as tragedy but as destiny, a destiny that many were beginning to accept as inevitable. In factories, shifts were reorganized. War production intensified. Workers received booklets with goals, efficiency instructions, internal surveillance slogans. Every screw, every valve, every box had to serve the cause. Mistakes were penalized. Distractions pointed out. Voluntary work was promoted for additional tasks. Those who complied were rewarded with diplomas, party lunches, free tickets to patriotic films. Those who failed were isolated. Religious life, tolerated under control, was absorbed by the war discourse. Christian sermons focused on sacrifice, on obedience, on the need to suffer for a greater good. Many pastors adopted the regime's language. Others remained silent out of fear. Only a minority, such as the confessing church movement, dared to resist openly, but their voices were weak. In parishes, masses were filled with mothers praying silently, more out of fear than out of faith. And yet, amid this landscape of discipline, of orderly lines and darkened kitchens, a childlike hope still remained alive. Most German civilians still believed that victory was possible. The images of occupied Paris, of bombed London, of defeated Greece fed the illusion. It was thought that if everyone complied, if everyone resisted, peace would return. But that peace would be a peace of victors, a peace without Jews, without enemies, without disobedient ones. In 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union underway, the Reich reached the peak of its expansion. From the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, the map seemed tinged with German grey. In homes, new maps were hung. Mothers marked with pins the place where their sons fought. Children learned new names: Smolensk, Kiev, Rostov. There was talk of oil, of wheat, of living space. And it was repeated that after this campaign, everything would be over. 1942, total war, scarcity, and the emergence of the black market. The year 1942 marked a profound change in the lives of German civilians. The illusion of a short war was dead, and with it the blind confidence in immediate victory. After the failure before Moscow and the fierce resistance of the Red Army, it became clear that the conflict would not only drag on, but would also demand ever greater sacrifices. Joseph Goebbels summarized it brutally in his speech of February of 1943, but the people already knew it before hearing him. The war had to be total, and that meant the home front could no longer behave like a spectator. Every civilian was now one more cog in the war machine. Every act, no matter how trivial it seemed, had to serve the cause. Scarcity became a structural part of daily life. Rationing, which at first had been lived with discipline and even a certain patriotic pride, now turned into an inescapable sentence. Meat disappeared from the counters. Butter became a luxury. Bread was made with dark flour, mixed with husks and starch. Beer was watered down. Clothes had to be mended until they could no longer be patched. Women turned curtains into dresses, old shirts into underwear, men's boots into shoes for children. The slogan was simple: throw nothing away. Everything was useful. Everything was reused. The urban population was the most punished. In industrial cities such as Essen, Hamburg, Dresden, or Berlin, the lines to receive rationed products began at dawn. Housewives carried cloth bags, empty tins, notebooks with substitute recipes. Sugar was replaced by molasses, milk by diluted powder. Soap was scarce, and women boiled roots to make homemade cleaners. The smell of sweat became common on trams, in schools, and in offices, but no one complained, because complaining was dangerous, and because everyone knew that at the front, the hardships were worse. The state began to intervene even in the kitchen. Official recipes designed by party nutritionists were disseminated. Manuals were distributed with tips on surviving scarcity: boil legumes twice, mix coffee with roasted barley, cook without fat. Women's magazines included sections with advice on how to make coats from blankets or use newspaper as insoles for shoes. Radios broadcast hygiene tips using cold water. The state dictated how to live, what to eat, how to dress, and civilians obeyed even if they cursed under their breath. Need forced ingenuity, but also illegality. The black market flourished. In train stations, on the sidewalks of working-class neighborhoods, in backyards, informal barter networks emerged. A bottle of liquor could be exchanged for 2 packs of cigarettes. A piece of bacon cost a week's salary. Contact with a farmer was more valuable than any political connection. Women walked kilometers on foot or by bicycle to reach rural villages where they could buy potatoes or eggs. They returned with their saddlebags full, fearing police checkpoints along the way. Trains were full of civilians carrying sacks, bundles, boxes with food hidden in their clothing. The state knew the black market existed and fought it ruthlessly. Harsh penalties were imposed: fines, prison, forced labor. Raids were carried out in markets. Suitcases were inspected on trains. Inspectors were sent into neighborhoods. Public trials multiplied. In some cities, the names and photos of hoarders or traitors to the people were displayed on boards in front of city halls. But the system was incapable of stopping the phenomenon, because even officials, officers, and party members participated. Everyone needed something, everyone bought or sold outside official channels, and no one was willing to starve for patriotism. The war effort demanded not only resignation, but growing physical and emotional surrender. Women replaced men in factories, offices, workshops, shops, trams. Double shifts were imposed. The slogan was to produce without rest. Every minute counted. Factories operated day and night. The chimneys never stopped. In many homes, women slept with their shoes on in case the air raid siren sounded. Children grew up without fathers and often without mothers. School was a place of passage. Teenagers were sent to work in the countryside, in munitions factories, to build trenches in the occupied territories. Free time had disappeared. So had childhood. The emotional tone of the country changed. There were no more celebrations, no joyful parades, no organized holidays. The Kraft Dutch Freude was practically dismantled. Cinemas closed more and more frequently. Theater became a luxury. Concerts were replaced by propaganda lectures. Language grew darker, harsh, decisive, necessary, final. Words like happiness, rest, beauty were left behind. Letters from the front spoke of mud, cold, blood. And the letters sent to the front carried perfume, sweet phrases, drawings from the children. They were many times kind lies. Because in the home front, people cried too, but the tears were hidden behind the curtain, far from the neighbor, far from the party, far from the blocklighter. The Jews who still remained in Germany were pushed into a point of no return. Beginning in 1942, their mass deportation to the east began. No one spoke of extermination. Euphemisms were used: resettlement, work in the east, evacuation. But the trains left full and never returned. The neighbors knew it. Some helped. Most remained silent. The homes of deported families were reassigned. Their furniture was distributed. Their coats were reused. Silence became complicity. Guilt was masked as necessity. In the midst of all this, propaganda did not let up. Goebbels spoke of resistance, of will of steel, of degenerate peoples who wanted to destroy Germany. Fear was invoked. If Germany lost, the revenge would be immeasurable. There was talk of Bolshevism, of Slavic hordes, of Allied bombings as signs of hatred against German culture. Every bomb that fell in Hamburg or Cologne was used to reinforce fear. Defeat was not a possibility. It was a foretold hell. That is why one had to resist. That is why one had to die, if necessary. 1943, Stalingrad, collective mourning and cracks in trust. The official report arrived in February of 1943. The 6th German Army had been annihilated in Stalingrad. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the radio did not broadcast a victory, but a catastrophe. It did not say so in those terms, of course. It spoke of heroic resistance, of sacrifice for the homeland, of eternal honor. But the Germans understood the message. Beneath the iron language, an unbearable truth was hidden. The war was being lost. And with that certainty, something broke on the home front. Not order, not obedience, but faith. Until then, even under rationing, censorship, and pain, most civilians had maintained a basic trust in the Führer. The successive victories, the domination over Europe, the image of the invincible soldier had kept alive a shared hope. But Stalingrad was something else. Stalingrad was a limit. Almost 300,000 soldiers sent to the encirclement, more than 90,000 prisoners, tens of thousands dead, and among them sons, brothers, husbands, Defeat was no longer a statistic, it was a telegram, it was an empty chair, it was a name that never appeared again. In homes, a silent, restrained, regulated mourning was unleashed. The state did not allow public manifestations of grief. Mothers who cried too much were singled out. Girlfriends who refused to continue with their activities were reprimanded. Morale had to be kept high. Pride had to be shown. That is why condolence letters arrived along with a pamphlet, "Your son fell for Germany." The ceremonies were brief, the tombstones provisional, there were no bodies, only news, and the feeling that the worst was just beginning. Goebbels' speech on the 18th of February of 1943 at the Sportpalast sought to channel that pain. He called for Krieg, total war, and demanded more work, more dedication, more discipline. He shouted that the enemies wanted to destroy Germany, violate their women, burn their houses. And the audience applauded, standing, frenziedly, but that ovation was different from the previous ones. It was not joy, it was fury, it was fear, it was despair. For the first time, the people felt that they had to fight not to conquer, but to avoid being annihilated. The logic of war had changed. Civilian life became even more rigid. Every area was reorganized. Factories multiplied shifts. Women were recruited for industrial, administrative, and technical tasks. Teenage girls replaced boys in farm work. School vacations were used to gather potatoes, repair roads, clean trains. Leisure was eliminated. Unapproved reading, concerts suspended, cinema limited to propaganda films. Everything else was considered superfluous, even dangerous. The culture of rumor flourished. Trust among neighbors weakened. No one knew for sure what was true. Foreign stations were listened to in secret. There was talk of terrible bombings in the West, of unstoppable Soviet offensives in the East, of entire divisions disappearing. The state denied everything, but people no longer believed as before. In the factory, at school, in the office, words were measured more than ever. Loyalty was not taken for granted. It had to be proven daily, the salute, the armband, the way of remaining silent when required. In the cities, the material situation deteriorated even further. Blackouts spread, the lines to get food became permanent. Empty stores, overcrowded trams, coats mended again and again were part of the landscape. Forced recycling was imposed. Clothing, metal, cooking fat, paper, everything had to be handed over. The slogan was, "Nothing can be wasted." But people felt that what was being consumed was no longer just objects. Morale, energy, and patience were being consumed. News from the occupied territories also arrived. Some were beginning to understand what the camps in the East meant. Not everyone knew, but many suspected. There was talk of loaded trains that did not return, of entire populations that disappeared, of men who returned with stories they could not tell. The repression of knowledge was as intense as the repression of emotions. To know was dangerous, to suspect even more so. That is why silence became the refuge of millions. And yet, routine continued. Children still went to school, women still cooked with whatever they found. Workers still pushed wagons, operated lathes, produced weapons. Propaganda exalted this resistance as heroic. It was said that the German people were different, capable of enduring what no other could. In part, it was true. But not out of glory, rather out of fear, resignation, inertia. Because the alternative was defeat, and defeat was no longer just political, it was an abyss. In hospitals, the wounded from the front filled the beds. Young men without legs, without faces, without words. They were displayed as examples of sacrifice. But their eyes said something else. Women cared for them in silence. Children looked at them in astonishment. And fathers, deep down, feared that their own sons would soon be there, or would not be there at all. In homes, an old word was recovered, durchhalten, endure, not with hope, but as a mandate, as the only option. The future had become blurred. People no longer dreamed of victory, but of surviving one more week. 1944, hunger, bombings, and passive resistance. In 1944, everyday life for German civilians became unsustainable. On top of increasing deprivation and the absence of men now came an inescapable, deafening and daily threat: bombs. Each day, cities were shaken by waves of aerial destruction that no longer respected time, geography, or weather. The Allies controlled the skies. The clocks knew it as they stopped after every impact. The mothers knew it as they counted their children when leaving the shelter. The bakers knew it as they opened each morning without knowing if they would still have a shop by nightfall. The war was no longer a distant front. Now it fell from the sky. The sound of air raid sirens became part of the urban rhythm. An alarm during the night meant groping down the stairs, searching for a flashlight, bundling up the children, stuffing into a bag the photographs, the papers, some bread. Many families slept fully clothed. Pregnant women gave birth in basements. Elderly people refused to go down, resigned to dying in their beds. In improvised shelters, people spent hours sitting in darkness, breathing the same stale air, listening to the hum of Anglo-Saxon bombers and counting the seconds between one falling bomb and the next. Entire cities were left in ruins: Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Kassel, Leipzig, Essen, Cologne. Where once there had been shops, cafes, churches, schools, there was now dust, twisted metal, corpses covered with blankets, craters filled with water. Bodies were buried hastily, often without names. In many neighborhoods, neighbors slept together at night in the few remaining basements. Privacy disappeared. People lived in forced community, in shared fear, in the faint hope of seeing the sunrise. Hunger, which had been managed for years through rationing, now turned into chronic malnutrition. Markets were empty. Fruit became a rarity. Meat a memory. Families stood in line for hours for bread that sometimes never arrived. Potatoes were the essential food when available. Roots were boiled, peels were eaten. The ersatz, substitutes, were no longer the exception but the rule. Barley coffee, boiled cabbage soup, flour mixed with sawdust. Diseases from nutritional deficiencies multiplied: anemia, rickets, tuberculosis. Children stopped growing. Women stopped menstruating. The body defended itself as best it could. The black market became vital, not just to survive, but to recover a bit of autonomy. A kilo of butter could cost the same as a coat. A piece of ham was a cause for dispute. Personal relationships began to depend on what one could obtain or trade. Contacts with farmers, railway workers, or municipal employees were worth more than any ideology. Stealing food from the state became a common act and was not considered a crime among civilians. It was adaptation. Theft, like lying, became another way to stay alive. Official propaganda continued hammering with words of steel. Goebbels ordered the cities to be plastered with phrases like "the Führer commands," "resist," "total war," "shortest war," or "every sacrifice counts." But something had changed. The slogans no longer convinced. People no longer looked at them. They no longer commented on them. They remained there, but were like the bells of destroyed churches, hollow sounds. In factories, workers obeyed out of habit. On trains, Nazi salutes were returned with empty gestures. The fervor of 1939 was now mere automatism. No one rebelled openly, but no one believed anymore. Trust had gone out. Disillusionment was not overt. It was silent. It was resignation. It manifested in small acts of passive resistance, pretending to be sick to avoid work, deliberately damaging a machine, not correcting an administrative error, hiding information. Some women refused to hand over their young sons to the Hitler Youth. Some teachers once again included censored poems in their classes. It was not a rebellion, it was a way to reclaim dignity, to feel human amid the machinery, to say no without speaking the word. Moral collapse advanced as well. There were children who stole food from corpses, elderly people who slept among rubble, women who offered sex for bread, for soap, for cigarettes. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Cemeteries had no more space. In many cases, bodies were incinerated with the garbage. Churches stood empty. The nationalist god of the Reich had been buried beneath the rubble of every destroyed synagogue, every bombed orphanage, every train station that had sent Jews to the east and was now being bombed by the Royal Air Force. Rural life, although less punished by the bombs, was no better. Farmers were pushed to exhaustion. They had to produce with fewer and fewer hands. Forced laborers, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, were watched by the Gestapo. Some tried to secretly help German civilians who arrived from the cities in search of bread. Others were denounced. The relationship between countryside and city grew tense, resentful. Many farmers hated the party bureaucrats, but they did not say it. They simply shut the door and went back to planting. In the home, women became the center of everything. They were nurses, cooks, teachers, gatherers, improvised leaders of broken communities. Many no longer had husbands. Either they were at the front, or they had died, or had simply been lost. Sons grew up without guidance. Daughters took on adult responsibilities. The future had become a question without an answer. "What are we going to do after this?" was a phrase no one uttered anymore, because no one could imagine an after. 1945, defeat, occupation, and the end of the everyday Nazi world. In the first days of 1945, Germans no longer spoke of final victory. The words changed. People spoke of surviving, of holding on a little longer, of saving the children. In shelters, in basements, on trains crowded with women and elderly fleeing west, conversations were short, cut off by the noise of engines, by sirens, by despair. Winter covered with a layer of frost the rubble of cities that were nothing more than names on the radio. And in the midst of that disintegration, German civilian life went on, disfigured, dragging itself along the edges of a collapsing regime and a society that no longer knew who it was. Defeat arrived before it was signed. It settled into faces, into skin, into bones. The cities were open cemeteries. Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, Frankfurt, Essen, all wounded, all open, all unrecognizable. People walked among rubble like ghosts. They looked for food, they looked for water, they looked for their children. Many times they found nothing. Some women, covered in ash, walked the streets with carts in which they carried a coat, a pot, a box of wet papers. They had lost their home, their husband, their faith, and still they kept walking. Because to stop was to let oneself die. The bombings were no longer sporadic, they were routine. But what weighed most was no longer the noise, but the silence that remained afterwards. The church bells were muted, the schools closed, the factories destroyed or empty. On many streets, not a single window was intact. People slept under broken roofs, cooked on improvised braziers, boiled snow to drink. There was no heating, electricity failed, radios were useless. The state had disappeared. The party as well. Only the remains were left, the dirty uniforms, the portraits of Hitler abandoned on piles of scorched papers. Fear was no longer of the enemies, but of the next day, of looting, of revenge, of the revenge that came from the East in Soviet uniform and with hardened faces. Rumors spread of mass rapes, of executions, of reprisals, and they were not rumors. The columns of refugees fleeing Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania carried on their faces the panic of what they had seen. Children who did not speak, women who did not sleep, men who hanged themselves from trees to avoid being taken prisoner. At stations, thousands tried to board trains that never came, or arrived full of defeated soldiers, of sick elderly, of unburied corpses. German women, mothers, sisters, wives became the last line of containment. Armed with buckets, shovels, torn sheets, they protected their children from the rain, from the cold, from drunken soldiers. Some carried poison pills or a hidden pistol or only a prayer. They shaved their heads, smeared their faces, pretended to be sick to avoid the inevitable. Many were raped, once, 100 times, in front of their children, in front of their parents. Dignity became an impossible luxury. Life, a mute animal act of resistance. In the towns where American troops entered, the occupation was different, more orderly, less brutal, but just as desolate. The liberated prisoners, the discovered camps, the seized documents revealed what many already knew, what others did not want to know, and what others pretended never to have seen. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the ovens, the lists, the photographs, the names, the neighbors, everything was there, and now people could no longer look away. In each occupied city, the Allies demanded collaboration. Burials were organized. The civilian population was forced to walk through the camps, to see the bodies, to smell death, to touch it, to count it. In some towns, local authorities committed suicide before having to face that truth. In others, they simply disappeared. In schools, teachers were interrogated. On the radios, official voices were replaced by foreign announcements. In the markets, the new currency was the cigarette. And justice, silence. The Nazi Party dissolved with the wind. No one saluted with an outstretched arm anymore. No one wore armbands. Portraits were burned, books hidden, badges buried, speeches forgotten. Some party members tried to go unnoticed. They changed their names. They disguised themselves as victims. Others were arrested. Others simply fled. But the truth no longer needed names. It was in everyone's eyes, in the empty houses, in the broken streets, in the trains that no longer departed. Nazi Germany did not fall like a house of cards. It fell like a sick body that rots from within until it collapses. And in its fall, it dragged millions. Those who believed, those who kept silent, those who benefited, those who survived, those who could not choose, all were left inside the same wound. In May of 1945, the war ended, but peace did not arrive. Occupation arrived, hunger arrived, judgment arrived. Memory arrived, and for millions of German civilians, the hardest moment came, having to live after having survived, having to look at the past, having to explain it to their children, having to rebuild a country not only destroyed in its buildings, but in its soul.